Leo Chen adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, not because it was crooked, he wasn't even wearing one, but because it gave him something to do while the nerves buzzed under his skin. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched ahead, ocean on one side, hills on the other, sunlight glinting off the windshield like it was trying to distract him. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, replaying his opening line in his head. Again. You've been called out of touch more times than your movies have been remastered. How does that feel? He smirked. Too harsh? Maybe, but it had bite. And in today's media landscape, bite got clicks. His editor had practically handed him the assignment with a wink. Go get the old cowboy. See if he's still got anything to say, or if he's just a museum piece propped up by nostalgia. Leo wasn't cruel. He just believed stories should challenge power, even if that power wore cowboy boots and squinted into the sunset. At 29, he'd already built a name for himself at the Forward Lens, a digital outlet known for sharp takes and zero fluff. He liked to think he asked the questions others were too polite or too scared to ask. And Clint Eastwood? Well, he was the ultimate test. The festival in Carmel by the Sea wasn't what Leo expected. No red carpets, no flashing bulbs. Just a quiet square lined with bookshops and art galleries. Strings of fairy lights already glowing in the late afternoon. A small stage stood near the old mission, draped in simple bunting. Folding chairs were scattered about, mostly empty. It felt more like a community picnic than a media event. Leo checked his phone. 3 missed calls from his producer. Where are you? He's already here. His stomach dropped. He grabbed his mic, slung his recorder over his shoulder, and hurried toward the back of the stage where a cluster of people milled around a shaded patio. And there he was. Clint Eastwood sat in a wooden chair, one hand resting on a cane, the other holding a paper cup of coffee. He wore a faded denim shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a straw hat tilted just so. No entourage, no handlers barking into earpieces, just a man who looked like he'd rather be fixing a fence than giving interviews. But his eyes, Leo noticed that right away, weren't tired or distant. They were alert, present, like he was already watching the whole scene unfold before anyone else had blinked. Leo took a breath, smoothed his shirt, and stepped forward with his practiced smile, the one that said, I'm friendly, but I'm not here to waste time. Mr. Eastwood? Leo Chen, from the Forward Lens. Mind if I ask you a few questions? Eastwood looked up slowly. Didn't stand, didn't frown. Just nodded once. Sure, Leo clicked on his recorder. Great, so you're 94. You've made films through 6 decades, won Oscars, even served as mayor of this town. But lately a lot of younger viewers say your work feels disconnected from today's world. Like it's speaking a language no one uses anymore. Do you ever worry your films don't speak to today's audiences? The question hung in the air, crisp and pointed. Leo let it sit. He even let the corner of his mouth lift just slightly, into that familiar smirk. It wasn't meant to be cruel, really. More like confident, like he'd just played his best card. Eastwood didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of coffee, set the cup down on a small table beside him, and then turned his full attention to Leo. Not with anger, not with defensiveness, but with a kind of quiet curiosity, like he was trying to figure out what kind of person would ask that question and why. You ever interview someone just to prove you're smarter than them? Eastwood finally said, voice low but clear like gravel wrapped in velvet. Leo blinked. The smirk vanished. I'm just asking what people are saying. People say a lot of things, Eastwood replied. But you chose that question. Not what do you hope people take from your work. Not what keeps you making films at your age. You went straight for the jab. Leo shifted his weight. His palms felt damp. I think it's a fair question. Art should be relevant. Fair? Eastwood leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing not in anger but focus. Fair's a courtroom word. We're talking about stories, about people. You ever sit with someone long enough to hear what they're really trying to say? Or do you just wait for your turn to talk? A few people nearby had stopped talking. Someone coughed. Leo felt the heat rise in his neck. He'd been ambushed, not with volume, but with stillness. With truth, I listen, he stammered. Eastwood nodded slowly like he was giving Leo the benefit of the doubt. Good, because listening's harder than talking. Always has been. Then, instead of ending the conversation, Eastwood did something unexpected. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. Sit down a minute, Leo hesitated. This wasn't in the script. He was supposed to get a quote, Maybe a soundbite of defensiveness and bounce. But something in the old man's tone, calm, almost kind, pulled him in. He sat. Eastwood didn't launch into a lecture. He didn't defend his legacy. Instead, he told a short story about a young reporter who'd come to interview him back in the 80s. Kid was nervous, hands shaking, but he asked honest questions. Didn't try to trap me. Just wanted to understand. We talked for an hour. He wrote a piece that actually made people think. Not just react, he looked at Leo. That's the difference. Reaction gets noise. Understanding gets change, Leo swallowed. His prepared follow-ups about politics, about cancel culture, about problematic scenes in old westerns, suddenly felt cheap. Like toys compared to real tools. Before he could respond, Eastwood asked, "What are you really here for, son?" Not kid, not reporter. Son. The word landed softly, but it hit deep. Leo opened his mouth. Closed it. For the first time in years, he didn't have a ready answer. The sun dipped lower. Shadows stretched across the patio. Someone called Eastwood's name from the stage. He was due to say a few words to the crowd. He stood slowly, using his cane for balance. But his posture remained straight, proud without being stiff. "Think about it," he said gently, then walked away. Leo stayed in the chair, recorder still running, though he'd stopped paying attention to it. The ocean breeze rolled in, cool and salty. Around him, people laughed, chatted, sipped wine. Life went on. But something inside him had shifted. He thought about his editor's email. Make it punchy. Make it viral. He thought about his own need to be seen as sharp, clever, ahead of the curve, and he thought about the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent a lifetime telling stories about flawed people, trying to do the right thing, even when no one was watching. On the drive back to the city, Leo didn't rehearse his closing line. He just drove, windows down, letting the wind clear his head. He knew he wouldn't file the story he'd planned. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Because for the first time he realized the best stories aren't the ones you force into the world. They're the ones that find you, when you finally stop talking long enough to listen. The drive back to the city felt longer than the drive down. Not because of traffic, there wasn't much, but because Leo couldn't stop replaying the conversation in his head. Every word Eastwood had said, every pause, every look. It wasn't that the old man had shouted or shamed him. That would have been easier to brush off. No. It was the quiet certainty in his voice, the way he'd looked at Leo like he saw right through the practiced confidence and straight into the uncertainty underneath. That was what stuck. By the time Leo pulled into his apartment complex, the sun had dipped below the hills, painting the sky in soft purples and oranges. He sat in his car for a few extra minutes, staring at the recorder in his lap. He hadn't even turned it off. He pressed play. His own voice came through, sharp and rehearsed. "Do you ever worry your films don't speak to today's audiences?" Then silence. A long one. Then Eastwood. "You ever interview someone just to prove you're smarter than them?" Leo winced. He sounded like a caricature of himself, clever on the surface, hollow underneath. He deleted the file, not because it was unusable, but because it felt dishonest, like he'd shown up with a mask and forgotten to take it off. Inside his apartment, the silence felt heavier than usual. His laptop sat open on the kitchen table, a blank document titled Eastwood Final blinking at him. He poured a glass of water, sat down, and stared at the screen. He typed a sentence. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Nothing felt right. Everything sounded either too defensive or too apologetic. He wasn't sure what he was trying to say anymore. He called his editor. "Hey," he said when she picked up. "I don't think I'm going to file tonight." There was a pause. "What happened? Did he cancel?" "No, he showed up. We talked, and," Leo exhaled, "it didn't go how I thought it would." "Meaning?" "Meaning, I asked the wrong questions." Another pause. Longer this time. "Leo, we need something by tomorrow morning. The festival's trending. People are waiting for our take." "I know," he said. "Just give me one more day." She sighed but agreed. "One day, and it better be worth it." He hung up and walked to the window. The city lights flickered below, cars humming in the distance. He thought about Eastwood sitting alone on that patio, sipping coffee like he owned no part of the noise around him. There was a calm in that man that Leo couldn't fake, couldn't write, couldn't even understand, not yet. The next morning, instead of heading to the office, Leo drove back to Carmel. He didn't tell anyone. Not his editor, not his roommate. He just packed a notebook, a fresh recorder, and a thermos of coffee, and hit the road before sunrise. This time there was no script, no agenda. Just a quiet need to figure out what had unsettled him so deeply. When he arrived, the town was already awake. Shopkeepers swept sidewalks, bakers pulled trays of bread from ovens, and a few early tourists wandered with cameras slung around their necks. The festival stage was being prepped for a screening that evening. $1 million baby, someone told him when he asked. Leo wandered toward the bookstore he'd passed the day before. Inside, the air smelled of paper and old wood. A woman behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Back so soon?" "I couldn't stop thinking about this place," he admitted. She nodded like that made perfect sense. "Clint's been coming here for decades. Always quiet. Always polite. Buys a book, chats for a minute, leaves a tip for the staff even though he doesn't have to. Does he come in often?" "Every few weeks. Picks up biographies mostly. Sometimes poetry. You wouldn't expect that, would you?" Leo smiled faintly. "No, I guess I wouldn't." He bought a worn copy of Eastwood on Eastwood, a collection of interviews from the 90s. Flipped through it over coffee at a corner cafe. The man in these pages wasn't the gruff icon Leo had imagined. He talked about doubt, about second-guessing scenes, about wanting to get out of the way so the story could breathe. "The camera doesn't lie," he'd said in one interview. "But the person behind it might." That line stuck with Leo. Later, he walked down to the beach. The tide was low, waves rolling in slow and steady. He sat on a driftwood log and watched a group of kids building a sandcastle. Their laughter carried on the wind. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about angles or headlines or how many shares a post might get. He was just there. That evening, he returned to the festival grounds. The screening hadn't started yet, but people were gathering, blankets and picnic baskets in hand. Leo found a spot near the back, away from the crowd. He didn't plan to interview anyone. He just wanted to watch the film, not as a critic, but as someone trying to see what others saw. When the opening credits rolled, he noticed something he'd never paid attention to before: the silence. Eastwood's films weren't loud. They didn't need to be. The tension lived in glances, in the space between words, in the weight of what wasn't said. In $1 Million Baby, the real story wasn't in the boxing ring. It was in the quiet moments between trainer and fighter, in the unspoken trust and the grief that came later. Halfway through, Leo realized he had tears in his eyes. Not because the story was sad, though it was, but because it was honest. It didn't try to be clever. It just showed people trying their best, failing, loving, hurting. And somehow that felt more radical than any hot take he'd ever written. After the film ended, people lingered, talking in hushed tones. No one was rushing to post a review or snap a selfie. They just sat with what they'd seen. Leo walked back to his car slowly. His phone buzzed, his editor again. He ignored it. He knew what he needed to do now, but he also knew it wouldn't fit into the usual mold. It wouldn't be punchy. It wouldn't be viral in the way they wanted. But it might be true. Back in his apartment that night, he opened a new document. This time, he didn't title it Final. He just started writing. He wrote about the smell of the ocean in Carmel. About the way Eastwood held his coffee cup like it was the only thing anchoring him to the moment. About the kids on the beach, the old bookstore. The silence in the film that spoke louder than any monologue. He wrote about his own smirk and how it had vanished the second someone looked at him like he mattered. Not just as a journalist, but as a person. He didn't mention politics. Didn't bring up old controversies or try to score points. He simply told the story of a young man who went looking for a target and found a mirror instead. When he finished, it was past midnight. He read it once, then again. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. He hit send. Then he turned off his phone, opened the window, and listened to the city breathe. Somewhere out there, an old man in a denim shirt was probably asleep, unaware that he'd changed someone's mind. Not by arguing, but by being still. And Leo? He finally understood. The best stories aren't about winning. They're about showing up, really showing up, and letting the truth find you. The response came faster than Leo expected. By noon the next day, his editor had read the piece and forwarded it to the managing team. He braced himself for criticism, for notes about tone or lack of edge, maybe even a request to rewrite it entirely. Instead, his phone buzzed with a single message. This is different. In a good way. We're running it as is. He stared at the screen, half relieved, half disbelieving. No edits. No push to add a snarky headline or a provocative pull quote. Just trust the story went live that evening. Within hours, comments started pouring in. Not the usual pile-on debates or sarcastic memes, but messages like, "This made me think," or "I watched $1 Million Baby again after reading this," or even, "Thank you for treating him like a person, not a symbol." One reader wrote, "It's rare to see someone admit they were wrong without making it a performance." Leo didn't respond to any of them. He just read them quietly, late into the night, feeling something unfamiliar, peace. But the real surprise came 3 days later, in the form of a plain white envelope left at the front desk of his building. No return address, just his name, handwritten in neat, slightly slanted script. He opened it carefully, half expecting a legal notice or a fan letter gone off track. Inside was a single sheet of paper. At the top, a simple line, "Good work. Keep listening." See, no flourish, no lecture, just those 5 words. Leo sat on the edge of his bed, holding the note like it might vanish if he moved too fast. He'd never met someone whose presence lingered long after they'd left the room. Until now. Eastwood hadn't needed to say more. He'd already said everything. Still, Leo couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just an ending. It was an invitation. Over the next few weeks, he began changing the way he worked. He stopped scripting his questions like courtroom cross-examinations. Instead, he'd spend time learning about his subjects, their fears, their quiet victories, the things they never got asked about. He interviewed a retired teacher who'd taught in the same classroom for 42 years, a street musician who played violin to pay for his sister's medical bills, a mechanic who rebuilt classic cars not for profit, but because they deserved to run again. Each story took longer. Each one got fewer clicks than his old, sharper pieces, but the responses were deeper. People wrote to say they saw their father in the mechanic, their grandmother in the teacher. They didn't just consume the stories, they connected with them, his editor noticed. "You've gone soft," she teased during a team meeting, but there was warmth in her voice. "Or maybe you've just grown up," Leo smiled. "Maybe both." One rainy afternoon, while sorting through old interview tapes, he came across the original recording from that first encounter in Carmel, the one he'd deleted, but had secretly backed up. On a whim, he played it again. Hearing his own voice now felt like listening to a stranger. The smugness, the rehearsed edge, it sounded so hollow. And Eastwood's reply, calm and unshaken, sounded even wiser than before. He realized then that the old man hadn't been defending himself. He'd been offering a choice. Stay on the surface and win the moment, or dive deeper and maybe change something real. Leo never sought out Eastwood again. He didn't need to. The lesson had already taken root. Months passed. Seasons shifted. The story about Carmel became a quiet benchmark in his career. The piece people referenced when they wanted to talk about the one where you actually sounded human. He didn't mind. In fact, he was proud of it. Then, one spring morning, he received an email from a small film archive in Monterey. They were hosting a retrospective on character-driven storytelling and wanted to include his article as part of a panel discussion on journalism with heart. Would he be willing to speak? He almost said no. Public speaking wasn't his thing. But then he thought about that patio in Carmel, about the way silence had spoken louder than any argument, and he typed back, "Yes." The day of the event, he arrived early. The room was modest. Wood-paneled walls, folding chairs, a projector humming softly in the corner. A few students, a handful of local writers, a couple of retirees who looked like they'd seen every film ever made. No cameras, no hype. Just people curious about stories that mattered. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't read from notes. He just talked about the smirk he'd worn like armor, about the moment it cracked, about how one quiet question, "What are you really here for?" had rerouted his entire path. He didn't glorify Eastwood. He didn't pretend to know the man. He simply shared what had happened, a collision of arrogance and grace, and how grace had won, not by shouting but by waiting. Afterward, a young woman approached him. She looked nervous, clutching a notebook. "I'm studying journalism," she said. "I keep getting told to be bold, to chase controversy. But your piece, it felt like a conversation, not a takedown. How do you do that without getting ignored?" Leo thought for a moment. You don't always, he admitted. Sometimes you do get ignored. But the people who stick around, they're the ones worth writing for. She nodded like that made sense, like it was permission to be kind and still be taken seriously. As he walked back to his car, the sun breaking through the clouds, Leo felt lighter than he had in years. He wasn't chasing virality anymore. He wasn't trying to prove he was the smartest person in the room. He was just trying to tell stories that honored the people in them, flaws, silences and all, and somewhere he liked to imagine, an old man in a straw hat heard about the talk, smiled to himself, and went back to reading his poetry, knowing that sometimes the smallest moments leave the deepest marks. Leo never became famous. He didn't win awards or land a TV show, but his work started to matter in a different way. Not because it shocked, but because it stayed with people. Long after the headlines faded, his stories lingered in quiet conversations, in late-night reflections, in the way someone might pause before asking a question, not to trap, but to understand, and that, he realized, was enough. More than enough. Because in the end, the best legacy isn't built on clever lines or viral clips. It's built on the quiet courage to listen, and the humility to let someone else change you, even when you thought you were the one holding the mic. Leo didn't plan to go back to Carmel. Not so soon anyway. But life has a way of circling back to the places that changed you, sometimes quietly like a tide returning to shore. It happened on a Thursday morning, 6 months after the note arrived. He was sorting through old interview tapes again, this time for a podcast series on everyday resilience. As he labeled a box Carmel 2025, his fingers paused. The name alone brought back the smell of salt air, the sound of distant waves, the weight of that single question hanging between him and a man who'd seen nearly a century of human noise and still chose silence over spectacle. He glanced at his calendar. The film festival was happening again next weekend. Smaller this year, he'd heard, more local, less media, just the way Eastwood liked it. Without overthinking it, Leo booked a room. Not for work, not for an assignment, just to see. He drove down Friday afternoon, windows down, music off. The highway felt familiar now, like an old friend who knew his moods. He didn't rehearse questions this time. Didn't bring a recorder. Just a notebook, a pen, and the same worn copy of Eastwood on Eastwood he'd bought on his last visit. The town hadn't changed much. Same bookshop, same cafe with the chipped blue awning, same quiet rhythm in the way people moved. Like they weren't racing toward something, just living inside the moment they were in. He checked into a small inn 2 blocks from the Mission. The owner, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, recognized him. "You're the writer," she said, handing him a key. "The one who wrote about listening." Leo blinked. "You read that?" "Everyone in town did," she smiled. Clint pinned it to the bulletin board at the community center. Said it reminded him why he still bothers. Leo's throat tightened. He didn't know what to say. "I just told the truth." "Sometimes that's the bravest thing," she replied, and went back to watering her geraniums. That evening, he wandered toward the festival grounds. No stage this time, just a pop-up screen in the courtyard behind the old theater. Folding chairs, blankets, a cooler of lemonade, a handful of locals, a few out-of-towners, kids running barefoot through the grass. It felt less like an event and more like a gathering. He spotted Eastwood right away. Not on a podium or in a VIP section, but sitting near the back. Alone, hands resting on his cane, hat pulled low. He wasn't watching the screen yet. The film hadn't started, but gazing at the sky where the first stars were beginning to blink through the twilight. Leo didn't approach. He found a seat a few rows away and waited. The film was unforgiven. Not the obvious choice for a crowd pleaser. It was raw, morally tangled, full of regret. But as the opening scenes unfolded, Leo understood why it was playing. It wasn't a Western about heroes. It was a story about men trying to outrun who they used to be, and failing. Beautifully, tragically. Halfway through, Eastwood stood slowly and walked toward the edge of the courtyard where a bench faced the ocean. Leo hesitated, then followed. He didn't say anything at first. Just stood a few feet away, watching the waves roll in. After a long moment, Eastwood spoke without turning. "You came back." "I did." "Still listening?" Leo smiled faintly. "Trying to." Eastwood nodded. "That's all any of us can do." They stood in silence for a while. The film played behind them. Gunshots, whispered confessions, the ache of a man who knew too late that some things can't be undone. Finally, Leo said, "I never thanked you." "For what?" "For not letting me get away with it." Eastwood turned then, eyes crinkling at the corners. "You would have figured it out eventually. Just saved you some time." There was no pride in his voice. "No, I told you so." Just simple acceptance, like helping someone see clearly, was as natural as offering them a chair in the shade. Leo took a breath. "I've been thinking a lot about legacy lately. Not the kind you see in headlines, the kind that lives in rooms like this. In the way someone treats a stranger. In the questions they ask, or don't ask." Eastwood looked out at the water. "Legacy's a funny word. People act like it's something you build, but really it's something you leave behind without knowing. Like footprints in wet sand. You walk, the tide comes. What stays isn't up to you." Leo wrote that down later in his notebook. Not for an article. Just for himself. They talked a little more. About films, yes, but also about patience, about how hard it is to stay kind in a world that rewards noise. Eastwood mentioned a young director he'd been mentoring. Someone who doesn't care about fame, just truth. He spoke with quiet pride, like a gardener watching a seed finally sprout. Before the night ended, Eastwood turned to Leo one last time. "You keep writing like you have been," he said, "and you'll do more good than you know." Then he tipped his hat just slightly and walked back toward the film, cane tapping softly on the stone path. Leo stayed by the ocean a while longer. The air was cool, the stars bright. He thought about all the stories he'd chased before, angry, urgent, hungry for reaction. And he thought about the ones he wrote now, slower, softer, but somehow stronger. Not because they shouted, but because they stayed. The next morning, before heading back to the city, he stopped by the community center. Sure enough, his article was still pinned to the board, slightly faded at the edges next to flyers for gardening clubs and lost dogs. Someone had written in pencil at the bottom, "Real talk. Thank you." He didn't take a photo, didn't post about it. He just stood there for a minute, then walked out into the sunlight. On the drive home, he called his editor. "I've got an idea for a new series," he said. "Stories about people who change others without trying to." She laughed. "That's your whole thing now, isn't it?" "Yeah," he said, smiling. "I guess it is." And as the miles rolled by, Leo realized something. He wasn't the same person who'd walked into that patio with a smirk and a script. That guy was gone, washed away maybe by the tide of a single honest moment. In his place was someone quieter, kinder, still flawed, still learning, but finally listening. And sometimes that's where the real story begins. A year after that first encounter in Carmel, Leo sat in a small classroom at a community college, facing a group of students who looked more tired than curious. It was late afternoon, rain tapping gently on the windows and the fluorescent lights buzzed like they were trying to stay awake too. He wasn't there as a star journalist or a viral writer. He was just a guest speaker for a media ethics class, someone the professor had read about and thought might have something real to say. He hadn't prepared a lecture. No slides, no bullet points. Just a chair, a cup of coffee, and the same notebook he'd carried since that first trip down the coast. "I used to think good journalism meant asking the hardest questions," he began, voice quiet but clear, the kind that made people squirm, the kind that got shared, argued over, clipped into hot takes. I thought being sharp was the same as being right. A few students glanced at each other. One yawned. Leo didn't mind. He'd been there too, skeptical, impatient, sure he already knew the answers. "Then I met someone who didn't answer my question," he continued. "He just asked me one back. 'What are you really here for?' And I didn't have an answer. Not a real one." He told them the story simply, no drama, no exaggeration. How he'd walked in with a smirk. How the old man had disarmed him with calm. How silence had done more than any clever line ever could. He didn't name Eastwood outright, just called him a filmmaker who'd seen it all, because this wasn't about fame. It was about the moment everything shifted. One student raised a hand. "But doesn't that make your job harder? If you're not trying to expose or challenge people, what's the point?" "Great question," Leo said. "The point isn't to avoid hard truths. It's to ask them in a way that invites honesty, not defensiveness. There's a difference between holding someone accountable and treating them like a target." He paused. "I used to confuse aggression with courage. But real courage is showing up without armor. Listening even when it's uncomfortable. Letting someone surprise you." After class, a few students lingered. One young woman with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers said, "I've been told my writing's too soft, that I need to be tougher to get noticed." Leo smiled. Tough doesn't always mean loud. Sometimes it means staying gentle in a world that rewards cruelty. That's harder and rarer. She nodded like she'd been waiting to hear that. Later that week, Leo's new series launched, The Quiet Impact. Each piece focused on ordinary people whose influence wasn't measured in followers or headlines, but in the lives they quietly shaped. A librarian who remembered every kid's favorite book, a bus driver who learned his regulars' names, a retired nurse who still checked in on old patients. No villains, no grand scandals, just humanity unfiltered. The series didn't break the internet, but it built something quieter and more lasting: trust. Readers wrote in not to argue, but to share their own stories of people who'd changed them without fanfare. Teachers, neighbors, grandparents. The kind of legacy that never makes a trending list but fills a lifetime with meaning. One afternoon, while sorting through reader letters, Leo found one with no return address, just a postmark from Carmel. Inside, a single sentence on plain paper: "You're doing it right." He didn't need a signature. He knew. That same week, he got a call from a documentary team. They were making a film about storytelling across generations and wanted to include his journey, not as a hero, but as an example of how one moment of humility can reroute a life. He agreed, but only if they focused less on him and more on the idea that listening is an act of respect, and respect is the foundation of every story worth telling. Months later, the documentary premiered at a small theater in San Francisco. After the screening, an older man approached Leo in the lobby. He wore a worn flannel shirt and moved slowly, leaning on a cane. His eyes were sharp, familiar. "You kept your word," the man said. Leo recognized the voice instantly. His heart jumped, but he stayed calm. "I tried," the man nodded. "Most people talk about change. You lived it." They stood there for a moment, two men from different worlds, bound not by fame or politics but by a shared belief that people deserve to be seen as they are, not as symbols. No photos were taken. No quotes given to the press. Just a handshake, a quiet "keep going," and then the man disappeared into the crowd. Leo never saw him again. But he didn't need to. Years passed. Leo's work evolved, but his core stayed the same. He mentored young writers, always telling them, "Don't chase the noise. Chase the truth and treat it gently." He turned down offers that asked him to be louder, angrier, more engaging in the algorithmic sense. He chose depth over speed, connection over clicks, and slowly, quietly, his approach began to ripple outward. Other journalists started writing with more curiosity and less combat. Editors began valuing empathy as much as edge. It wasn't a revolution, just a shift, like the tide turning one grain of sand at a time. On his desk, above his monitor, still pinned with a small magnet, was the first note. "Good work. Keep listening. See." It had yellowed at the edges, but the words were as clear as the day they arrived. He never became a household name. He never wanted to. But in the lives he touched, through stories, through conversations, through the simple act of showing up with open ears, he left something that lasted. Because in the end, the most powerful stories aren't the ones that win arguments. They're the ones that open doors, that remind us we're all just people, trying to be seen, trying to matter, trying to leave something good behind. And sometimes all it takes is one quiet question, and the courage to really hear the answer.